Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 7 of the W podcast. It's a special edition because you have the friendly neighborhood healers. I'm Wolvy. I have SaucyJay with me, but in this episode, we have a special guest. That's Mr. Shah up there. And I'll just throw it straight to you so you can introduce a little bit and tell us more about yourself. And that's also going to introduce the topic for today's episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As you just mentioned, my name is Shah. I'm primarily a Brewmaster player, but I do play all of the tanks, as well as I do dabble in some off-specs, DPS, and healing alike. I raid pretty casually in this game, 2 days a week in a cutting-edge guild, but I mostly spend my time in Mythic Plus, both with fighting my way in the trenches with PUGs, as well as pushing with friends in my guild.
Right. I mean, CE is not exactly what I would call casual for raiding, but yeah, props if you can get CE with just 2 nights of raiding. Yeah.
I think it's pretty tame in terms of schedule. I have a lot of people that I talk to who raid 3, 4 nights a week.
Yeah.
And they go a little bit harder at the start of the season and they tame it down later on. So I always consider like 2 day a week pretty casual because it's a fairly low time commitment. But anyways.
Yeah. Oh, I think the community mostly knows you as the tank player. And today's topic of the podcast is mainly going to revolve around tanks and tanking because this has been one of the hot topics and maybe one of the pain points in this season. So, the first question to you is, I guess, how was the season for you so far tanking? Was it enjoyable? Did you have a good time?
Yeah, so I'm still actively pugging keys a lot. I've really enjoyed the season so far, but it's kind of weird because this is my favorite season, but it's also my least favorite season by far. Um, in pre-made groups, it's been absolutely enjoyable. That like not having to deal with the fixes, being able to just kind of get in there every week and just blast, really focusing on the dungeon mechanics has been an absolute treat. On the other hand, when you're pugging, generally I'm doing like when I'm pugging, I'm doing like 10s, 11s, 12s. So I'm generally dealing with those affixes more. They add more complicated like nuance to mechanics, especially boss fights when you're trying to like soak orbs while also like running away from like the suck in Arakara. It's just been like the worst experience ever, but also the best, I guess. Like if I had to sum it up.
Yeah, so I guess having a pre-made group makes the whole difference. This is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and it's just like weird because the affixes, like we can look back at like Dragonflight affixes and how annoying those could have been. The Zalteth affixes give you this like interesting kind of kiss curse dynamic, but the way they interact with the dungeon is a little painful. And when you're pugging, you're getting a total variance of players. But when you're playing with your friends, not only are you generally in Discord, but you also eventually remove those affixes when you're getting into 12s and higher, and then you don't have to worry about that anymore. So it's been this like really weird dichotomy of the keys are horrible in my opinion all the way up till 11s, and then they get really good from 12s up, but then there's like this really massive pain point that comes in around like the 15-16 benchmark when everything starts to one shot. So it's for me it's been great pushing, but yeah, it's it's the dungeons below 11 is horrible, big miss in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean that's probably the same feeling. And most of our audience, I think, falls in that category. I think a lot of the folks, when you go through our comments, are kind of in that under 12. I wouldn't say most of them, but there's a mix. There's some higher key players, obviously, and then there's some lower key players. But yeah, I mean, can't agree with you more. Especially in the beginning of the season, it was just insane with like the orbs going through the water or just any kind of V access thing going on. It was just kind of crazy. So yeah, pretty interesting at the beginning. Seems that tamed out a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's Blizzard's made some good changes to fix things, whether it was like bugs with the orbs going into like the Siege of Borealis on Vic Goth at the very end. But also they are changing the affixes going into 11.1, which I think is pretty interesting. They're like homogenizing the kind of downside of the affix instead of making enemies like take less damage or have more haste and stuff. They're just like making them just do more damage as like a flat punishment instead. And I'm not sure how you guys feel about that, but I think that's a really good change because things like haste have a different like multiplier on how mobs work in dungeons. So when a couple mobs or a boss got a little bit of haste, it would make mechanics almost impossible to deal with. Where a flat damage you can at least counter with like using a defensive. But did you guys see that, or how do you guys feel about it?
Yeah, for sure. The two that come to mind for me, probably in gosh, the fairyland after the maze, where if those beetles get a haste, you cannot get out of the poison orb and you
Miss,
get
yeah.
launched. Yeah, mist is nuts. And then obviously Grim Batol, there's a couple in there where if the haste modifier hits them, it's you're gonna get one shot. Those are two that stand out for me.
Forgot what I think it was. I think it was like yesterday or 2 days ago. I was in Arakar on the last boss on Kikatal, and she got like 3 or 4 haste orbs, and the suck-in erupted though before you actually got gripped, so it actually made the boss easier, which was like really weird. I've never seen that interaction before, but I thought that was kind of funny.
Well, they are removing the orbs though. I think that was the one affix that they said they're gonna get rid of, and there's gonna be a new one that's not clear exactly what it does from the
Yeah,
description. But yeah,
it like
I don't
spawns
think
orbs around
anyone's
the
gonna
player.
be. Yeah, I don't think anyone's gonna be feeling sorry for this affix being gone. To be honest.
No,
Yeah.
it's been a massive headache, especially now. This time of the year, it's a lot of people are playing PoE, a lot of people are playing Marvel Rivals. So I've been pugging a lot, and I'm just doing my like weekly tens, and it's I'm looking forward to these fixes getting changed and these going away for sure.
Yeah, we actually get the sentiment a lot because we both are mostly pugging our keys. We rarely play in pre-made groups. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone complain about 12s and above, because even if you're pugging, once you get to this point, it's actually, you don't have to deal with this because we're healers. So we also have to deal with this dispel affix, which is considered a healer affix, but it's not exactly a healer affix. Different topic,
What do you
right?
mean? That's for sure a healer effect.
Yeah, you cannot
Just
actually
massive
heal
spell.
through it unless you like pop a cooldown or something, and then in like keys below 10, people just don't press their dispels, so it's all up to you to deal with. And Blizzard actually said in the past they understand, okay, it's bad if you have to dispel it, and there's another dispel mechanic like the last boss in Siege of Borealis. So they acknowledge it's problematic with the Afflicted back then, and now they're actually presenting us with the same thing. But yeah, my point is, I don't think anyone ever complained that there's no affixes basically after 12s and above. So I think everyone joins you with what you just said. It feels so great to play the keys after 12, although they do get very hard very quickly, but that's a different topic. And then, yeah, there is a keys curse for the affixes below that, but yeah, some of them are actually very annoying to deal with. So having said that, how would you compare the experience in the War Within with what you actually had in Dragonflight? Is it better, worse, the same level?
There's like this is a whole can of worms. There's so many different points here that I could make. My experience generally has been better. Obviously, there's like been a ton of tank nerfs going into the War Within that Blizzard I think really missed the mark on. So as a tank player, I've enjoyed it somewhat less from like a tanking standpoint. Though I think like the dungeon set is just better, and I think not having like to deal with things like thundering and things like afflicted, like those types of affixes, not having to deal with them anymore, especially as you get into kind of those push keys, has been way more enjoyable. And I find that I'm playing the game way more than I was in Dragonflight, even though I went degenerately hard in Dragonflight.
Okay. Well, you mentioned tank nerfs, and this is basically my next question. But before that, for people who pug, and okay, I see you're pugging too, but you're the tank. For the rest of us, when you pug and when you push your keys a little bit higher, it gets harder to find keys because there's simply less keys for people who are like pugging 13s, 14s, and so forth. So once you go up that ladder, it becomes a little bit harder to get into keys. But now there's an extra layer on top of that because it seems, for whatever reason, that the tanks are much less this season. So it's usually the case, you try to get into a key for, let's say, 15, 20 minutes. You finally get an invite. You might be a healer. You might be a DPS. And then you end up waiting for like 20 more minutes for a tank to show up simply because they're not there. You probably don't experience that, but it's a huge problem for the rest of the community. And as I said, our next topic is the tank busters. Do you think that this is one of the main reasons that people kind of went away from playing a tank role and just opted to either quit the game or go DPS or heal?
There I don't even know where to start with this. So I think the first big issue was that they did nerf tanks. The most compelling thing about being a tank was being immortal, especially if you were good at your class. What they've done is they've raised the skill floor, making it harder to tank, and they've lowered the skill ceiling, making it more punishing for players who can play at the highest level. So it's kind of it's just made tanking a little bit more annoying. I actually kind of have to think in keys now. Before I used to be able to just kind of go in and go with the flow and it'd be fine. I have clips I'm sure I can pull up from Dragonflight where I'm just soloing pulls for 2-3 minutes after my group dies and they're all running back. I mean, I've been able to do that this tier as well, but it's just a lot more difficult to do. So you have that component where they make tanks a little less powerful in like a defensive regard as well as offensively. They're doing generally they're doing less damage than they have in the past compared to what DPSs are able to perform. On top of that, they also nerfed the power of like damage trinkets. So that's kind of the fun thing about tanks in the past is like you could really push your damage even further by getting DPS trinkets, and that's no longer the case. On top of that, they don't have any good defensive trinkets in the game, so you're really just running stat sticks. So you're playing the class, which would make sense from like a game design standpoint because they introduced these new hero talents, which are kind of powerful. But they add a lot more button bloat to some specs, which has also made tanks more difficult to play because there's now all these different layers of nuance to every single spec. And I guess like sub-spec these hero talents. So I think tanking has just become extremely more complicated, but without the reward of how powerful you were able to be in previous tiers. And I think that's ultimately why tanks are quitting now. It's of course it's subjective. One tank might quit because he started playing in Head Shaman and he loves it. Another tank might quit because he just doesn't play WoW anymore. But I've actually noticed as a tank, I notice sometimes healers are extremely hard to find. Have you guys heard those kind of like claims before?
Oh,
we're healers, so.
kind of, yeah. But
I guess not. Yeah. So it's weird to ask a tank like why the tanks are queuing because I'm not sure. I'm queuing up.
Yeah.
I recently did I'm gonna actually have a video releasing in a couple of days. I did a 0 to hero challenge as Preservation Evoker. Extremely fun healer to play. But I like throughout the whole challenge, and maybe I only went up to 10s, but maybe beyond that it's harder to find tanks. But all the way up to 10s, tanks were insanely easy to find. It was just how good they were. And again, that's where it comes back to like that skill ceiling and skill floor were moved around, making good tanks harder to find.
Yeah,
I guess.
We had a healer guest here a few episodes back, and he said, guys, because we had the same sentiment. There's no tanks once you go 10s and beyond. And it was like, I know where the tanks are. They're just in 5s and 6s, and they stay there because they get one-shotted and just people kick them out of the group, so they go and continue to do 5s and 6s, but they don't progress beyond that. And that goes back probably to the fact that the tanking now is much harder compared to what it was before. And
it's much harder.
Sure. And one thing that I'll say, and that's kind of like I was actually advocating for in Dragonflight for tanks to be able to be healed a little bit, because in Dragonflight I didn't heal the tanks. They were just so powerful that in my mind they could have like a queue with 5 tanks. They wouldn't need anything else, but they just couldn't beat the DPS check and the timer. That was the only problem. It's not like surviving or healing or something like that. So I was saying maybe if they want to make healing more fun, let the healers heal the tanks. And this is exactly what happened, but I guess now this is what we get, but it's not exactly what we were imagining is going to happen, because as a side effect now tanks are just unwilling to play. So from that perspective, I guess making it harder is a minus. That's something that you were alluding to as well, right?
Essentially, and it's similar to how probably AUG evokers feel. Like, I mean, AUG is obviously extremely popular, but it's so niche because tanking right now is you're a tank, like you're in control of your own survivability as well as the routing. But if you don't enjoy that aspect, then you probably won't enjoy the role. Just like AUG, like if you like to do big damage, you're not gonna probably enjoy AUG because you're mostly buffing others and focusing more on crowd control as a support spec. So, tanking is just kind of fallen back into what it is, which is get hit in the face and pray your healer in your group know how to keep you alive, and that isn't enjoyable for I think a lot of people who were tanking in Dragonflight, where you can go on a Vengeance Demon Hunter, you were competitive with damage, you were completely locking down everything, and like you didn't really care, and you felt immortal, and now that's not the case anymore.
Yeah,
I still think we were talking about this on the other episode, and you kind of hinted to it in this one, where the skill cap for entry, and then kind of the ceiling are kind of tighter now. But I find that the tanks that understand that I'm passively healing them. You know, I'll throw prayer mending or renew or keep a bubble on them or whatever. And for the most part, they're pretty good with kind of passive healing. But then you get a tank that may be new to the spec or new to tanking in general, and it's like babysitting. So I think that also is a case where the good tanks still kind of manage their own kind of survivability for the most part, unless it's like a really like, for example, Stone Vault. You know, if maybe if the healer isn't managing to dispel right on the first boss, maybe that could be a little bit scary for a tank. But outside of that, I feel like the good tanks really don't need a lot of maintenance when it comes to heals. What do you how do you feel about that?
I think that's generally true. Obviously, there's times where they'll need attention, whether it's through like environmental damage or a large recovery after a large tank buster, or I guess kind of the opposite of that is like making sure you're helping them mitigate for a tank buster through like things like pain suppression or time dilation, etc. I would say that the skill ceiling is to the point where a good tank player who is like honed in and doing their thing right, no matter what tank you're playing, whether it's a prop paladin or a brewmaster, you're probably going to be pretty efficient. Something that I noticed through my zero to hero challenge when I was healing is that a lot of tanks, and this surprised me, is that a lot of tanks don't even keep up their active mitigation. I can't even tell you how many times I see paladins not using Shield of the Righteous. Warriors aren't keeping up Ignore Pain or Shield Block, and it kind of blows my mind because is that is the core thing you do first,
That's your
right? Like
job,
as
right? This is the one thing you're there
that's
for.
that's the one thing you're there for, exactly. So it's funny, and I think some tanks maybe don't understand what their priority is, because I think again in Dragonflight it taught us a bad habit of just do damage because you're gonna live everything, and that has created kind of this I don't know, ideology where that's all you have to do in keys, just like hit buttons that glow or just try to do damage, and that's not always the best thing to do as a tank. You have to put survivability first, and ironically enough, the damage comes with most tanks. Playing defensively is what gives you your damage. So I see tanks kind of fail at both parts of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
We get a lot of comments that both for healing and now for tanking already that uh, those roles are they carry a lot of responsibility. And specifically in the War Within, it all very often feels that like if you make a one mistake, if you mispress one button or you're late with one cooldown or something like that, no matter if you're tank or healer, that mistake usually costs a wipe, like everybody dies, right? While the DPS mistakes, they're mistakes, but you just look dumb on the meters or something, and it's not that the whole group wipes. And now with the affix that's 15 seconds to that means your timer is basically gone because you just added over a minute to it, etc. First, what is your take on that? Do you agree? Like, is it too much responsibility to have as a tank and a healer, and one mistake could cost basically the whole run and break the key?
It's like it's interesting because I don't know if responsibility is the right word, but it's definitely this really tight window that you always have to be on for a tank or for a healer. Whether it's like getting your ramps perfect for whenever the first boss of Stonevault Edna does her when she's bursting the pillars or does her slam, or him, I don't know, it's a machine, I guess. Like if you miss that as a healer in a high key, it's a wipe. And if you aren't mitigating properly for a certain tank buster as a tank, if a tank dies, the group's gonna die. That's kind of just how it works. And it feels way, way, way more punishing because, again, like you just said, if a DPS dies, they might just be running back. You send a battle res, and no one's really going to look at that. But right now, we're in the season. It's if you group wipes, especially with the punishment on the timer, the key might be burnt, and then that kind of goes back into why tanks might not be able to learn, especially in lower keys. Is that a tank might mess up on a mechanic and they die, but they don't get the opportunity to learn from it and do that pull again because DPS are just going to leave, and then it's like kind of pointless. Which is unfortunate because DPS can die all the time, and they might learn, they might not. In my experience, they don't really learn, but healers and tanks have way more. I don't think it's responsibility, but like they have to be on the whole key. They can't make any mistakes, or the whole key's bricked for the entire group. Which feels bad, especially if you're playing with like friends and stuff, and you feel bad because you're like, oh man, I just wasted your guys' time, and I messed this up. But luckily, when you are playing with people and not pugging, your friends are a little bit more open to that, or they'll even help you figure out what you did wrong or what the group did wrong, or how you can optimize the pull, which is my favorite part about Mythic Plus, is being like, hey, we wiped here. How can we fix that?
Yeah. Oh, going back to what you said, those pulsing bosses, like the first boss in Arakara, the second boss in Dawnbreaker, no matter what healer you're playing there, you have to prepare. Doesn't matter if you're reactive or preemptive healer. You have to prepare. You have to know what cooldowns you're using, and then you have to execute perfectly. Because if you're late with or you miss one GCD, somebody's gonna die. And I also had a lot of occasions where like the tank is setting up a big pool, he jumps into the middle of a pack and he just perishes, like he dies because he didn't press the defensive, and he's like, "Oh, sorry guys, I was late pressing my defensives," or something like that. Which is why I'm asking you this question. And there was actually some changes recently that Blizzard did. There was an article that it was the Mythic plus Dungeon tuning, and most of that was just some of the tank busters were getting nerfed, some of the big damage that comes from bosses was also getting nerfed. And I think everybody was welcoming that, but we also got a lot of comments. This is like way too late in the season. It should have been done way earlier so that, you know, people tanks wouldn't quit, things like that. So what's your take on that? I guess you're welcoming these, but are they too late?
Definitely welcomed, but a tale as old as time is Blizzard is way too late to these changes. These these abilities were problematic on beta. They were reported on beta, and here we are in the not only the 11.05 but the 11.07 patch when these are essentially getting implemented.
Yeah.
Very late into the season. And these aren't big enough changes. I don't think any tanks like sitting at home watching scrolling through WoW and being like, "Oh look, they nerfed. I'm gonna go log back into WoW and go into Stonevault again." They're just too late. They're always welcome, but there's just a point in the season where it's kind of just like we like applaud them for trying, but I don't know what Blizzard, like I don't know their process for this. I don't know if they need enough data from like enough runs from Warcraft logs or if they're looking at their own internal data. But it always blows my mind how they're kind of, it feels like they're almost oblivious to these until it's way too late.
Yeah.
And
They need
I
to-
wish yeah.
Go ahead, finish your thought.
Oh no, I was gonna say I wish they were more open about these changes or what they're looking at. In like Blue Post being like, hey, we noticed that Stone Vault runs are being completed like 10% less than all these other runs. We're taking a look at specific mechanics, and then like at least we would know, or they would open up, I don't know, a conversation for people in the community to actually give feedback, like, hey, this is the thing that keeps wiping our run, and maybe that would lead to Blizzard being able to make these changes faster. I can't imagine that these tuning knobs of 10% nerf here and there is like a hard thing to change. I mean, I'm not a developer, I'm kind of an idiot, but I can't imagine it's like that difficult to adjust a percentage in a string of code.
Yeah, part of me says I wish they would play a little bit more, right? Or mandatory play the game a bit so they could actually feel some of this. The other thought I have on this really is like it's more focused on pugs because I'll say being a healer, when I play my warlock, right? I notice that I'm usually full health because I'm a healer and I know here's a big damage coming out. I'm going to hit Dark Pack or I'm going to hit my wall or I'm going to have XYZ, right? And I notice everybody else is like dead. And that's because we heal a lot. Probably same thing for a tank when you play damage. It's like you know what's coming so you can prepare for it. So when I see things like this, I feel like it's a way to allow kind of the pug community and maybe some on the lower keys and maybe even on the higher keys to be able to get through a couple of the humps. But again, I think it's way too late, and it would be nice to get some visibility around why are we taking halfway through the season to get these out when we're making all these balance tuning adjustments for the characters. We should also be doing that for these keys.
Yeah, and that was exactly our sentiment the first time we actually read this and we showed it on the podcast. Yeah, those are nice, but this is definitely not going to make anyone come back and play the game. What's left for like switching to play tank and try something new. They had one more kind of like in the same thread, which I'm not sure if it was even necessary, but they buffed the thread for tanks with I think it was 22%, something like that. So actually that's going to be a change in 11.1. So it's not live yet, although I thought it's a hotfix. Doesn't
It looks
really
like
matter.
it states hotfix on live servers.
Yeah.
So I'm not. I'd imagine it's in. Honestly, I haven't really noticed a difference.
Yeah.
That kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Is like tanks who like mitigate will do more damage, which then gets you threat.
Yeah.
So like I don't know. Like I've never had an issue with threat. Sometimes like if a rep paladin just starts slamming Divine Storm a little too fast, but generally speaking, if you set up a pull efficiently as a tank, threat hasn't been an issue. It's always a fine line to cross though, or like to walk for Blizzard, because if you make threat too strong, then it's irrelevant, and if you make it too weak, it's problematic. And we saw that like way back in BFA, and I can't remember. I think they removed it going into Shadowlands, but like the skittish affix way back when. Like that affix was extremely problematic. I think their hope there was to like make misdirections more valuable, but misdirections are so outdated as well. So yeah, I don't know. Threat's not really an issue, so this buff is kind of like, I'm just like whatever. I don't think a 22% buff means anything. Maybe it helps some of the lower end tanks, or maybe tanks who are a little bit undergeared, but threat's not really been an issue in my opinion.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same. I do play Enhancement and Elemental Shaman, so sometimes if you get a Tempest proc and you save it for the next pool and you send it straight away, maybe you can pull aggro then, but that's actually on you, you know?
I
So,
wonder why that happens.
yeah.
I
That's
wonder why.
that's how it happens. But then you can do a little bit of setting up, you know? You don't have to like, that doesn't have to be like the first thing you send in, because if you do it, you're gonna pull aggro. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But like
Are you just saying, yeah. Sorry, I was gonna just say, are you the guy who's like, I just hit one button. I don't know why I pulled.
Yeah, it was one button, man. It's like the only button that does damage for me, but that's a different topic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
man.
I guess that's relatively irrelevant, but it's at least like a bone to chew on, because hey, it's a tank change. We're making them more better or whatever. You know, they don't need that, but it's there.
I think the average tank probably enjoys it. I also think the average tank probably doesn't pay attention to Wowhead and these like kind of minor buffs, so they probably don't really notice it. But I think if you told every tank player in the world, the majority of them would be happy with tank buffs or a threat buff. And I think the rest of them are just kind of like, whatever. Like I wasn't really struggling with threat, but I'll take it.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking forward, we have a new patch coming up eventually, maybe early March or something like that. What do you think needs to happen with tanks in general, just to make it better for the tanks that are playing right now, and possibly even to get more tanks to play into the game? What are your hot takes or wild takes on that topic?
Oh God. I think this was an interesting season for tanks, and they experimented with kind of pulling back some of the power that tanks can have in terms of survivability and damage. I think they should revert them. Like personally, I think make tanks strong again. 2025. I don't. I don't think that's like the core issue though. I think the core issue actually comes down to dungeon design. I think dungeons need to be like more engaging, and certain tank busters and mechanics need to be less punishing, both for like new players, but also at the higher end when it starts getting into like one-shot territory. Like I don't know if you guys are aware, but there's like strategies where you have to line of sight certain tank busters. You have to like use certain mitigation. You have to be like super coordinated with your healer or your defensive management, and they kind of nerfed the cadence of cooldowns in keys, so it's very difficult to achieve that in the higher end. So eventually you start hitting like 15s and 16s and a little bit higher than that, and you have to play like pitch perfect or you're just going to like fall over, and I think that's a little too punishing. I don't know how do you guys feel though, like healing this season? Like tanks, obviously it sounds like sometimes you feel like you're babysitting, sometimes you feel like they're healthy, but do you actually feel like the tank nerfs made your job more enjoyable? I guess we could start there, and then maybe I can elaborate more.
I'll let you go, Wolvy.
Oh, as a person who actually was asking for that, I'll say this, and it's probably not gonna get a lot of traction in the comments, but I actually like them because, as I said, the good tanks I still don't have to heal that much. And if you know the dungeon, for example, I know that there's a tank buster, or you're pulling the guardians and mists of Tyrna side, etc. Right? I know that you're gonna need a little bit of healing, right? And that is fine for me. If it's a bad tank, I don't care. Like I figure out that if it's a bad tank, it doesn't matter how much I heal them. They're gonna find ways to die and wipe us. So it's kind of like the same with the good tanks for a different reason. You don't heal them. So from my perspective, it's not that bad. Now let me mention, we don't play plus 16s, like we push to like 13s, 14s. That's our cap. But it does feel like you do have to play pitch perfect, as you mentioned, even in those keys. I could only imagine it gets even worse into higher keys, although, as I said, you cannot miss GCDs in like 13s and 14s. So I don't know how you can get even more perfect into higher keys, because you're already playing perfect, right? Yeah, so from that perspective, it doesn't feel like healing was worst specifically for tanks. But I think healing feels very punishing for mistakes for something that you just mentioned, the dungeon design and how the bosses are designed and how the damage profile is. Because we were complaining a lot in Dragonflight that there were a lot of one-shot mechanics and you just couldn't heal through them. So now they decided to take a step back a little bit, and they have all this pulsing damage, which is not all the damage at once, but now it goes out for like 4 or 5 seconds, something like that. So now you have to kind of like schedule everything and press everything perfectly in those 3-4 seconds so that people actually don't die when they're taking probably 2 times their health bar in damage. And this is also something that we've been asking for, but now that it's here, it also doesn't seem a lot better, which is why I ask you, what do you think needs to happen for the next season? Because we are asking Blizzard for all those things. Sometimes we get them and we don't end up where we think we would be. There was a lot of sentiments that people were saying, okay, just double the health bars of everyone, just keep everything else the same, so people will be taking the same damage and will have more time to heal them, etc. Do you think that's actually a solution that could work?
I'm not. I wish I knew. I wish I knew the magical solution. I think when it comes to dungeon design, they definitely need to look at the group damage taken when it comes to like overlaps. You have like things that deal group damage and environmental damage, and then you also have bolts and stuff that get off because there's missed kicks or you're just out of kicks. Even if you're playing well, sometimes there will just be bolts that go through, and then when there's overlap, you kind of have to make this like very split-second judgment to use the defensive if you notice that that specific mob in this 9-target pack is targeting you, and that's difficult to do for most players. So I think one thing that they could do is they could buff health and just keep most of the kind of numbers the same in terms of percentages, so you do have time to react. That bolts aren't that punishing. But I could only imagine that could cause other issues or other tuning imbalances with like healing through. But like, I'm not sure how healers would actually feel about this. Like, wouldn't your heals feel much less effective? Do you like when your heals feel powerful and can top people quickly, or do you like that slow rot gain?
That was the complaint, and that's why they didn't double the health pools, because the complaint was then the healing doesn't feel impactful. When you push a big heal, you don't see this big bar going up, but then when you have, like Wolvy was saying, you're getting twice your health done over the span of like 6 seconds, that could be very punishing if you're not timing it correctly. So I think, they're trying to figure it out, but I could say that, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is either, but I think, when you look at like things like that, that was the biggest concern, was just like, oh, if you just double the health pools, then my heals don't feel impactful. When I push big cooldowns, the bars don't go up, or they go up very minimally, and that doesn't feel good as a healer. And then going back to the other comment about how do we feel about like tank, reliance and them needing us more now, I don't think I haven't noticed a big difference, honestly, in the sense of when I have a good tank or when I have a bad tank. So even last season, when you had a bad tank, you knew it. When you had somebody that wasn't pressing their demon spikes or their ignore pain or whatever, you knew it. It was painful. When you had a good tank, you never healed them. I almost feel the same again, except for the very exceptional. And again, we're not doing 16s, right? We're doing 12s, 13s, and things like that. But it's the same kind of experience where it's like very minimal, right? A pain suppression, a dome, spirit link, cocoon, whatever the external is, or the ramp. As long as you do those things right, you're really just kind of, the first few pulls of the dungeon, you're like, who's my squishy person? And I'm going to maintain those people. That's the one I'm actually watching for the most part. And hopefully it's not the tank who should be doing what they're doing and not, So, I don't think whether they go either way, I think it just makes it tougher for the healer and the tank, especially when you come into situations where it's a pug and you don't necessarily know the skill of the person that's coming in. You're going to realize it pretty quickly, but it just makes it a little bit more difficult. But I think you just adapt to it, and at the end of the day, so.
And I'll add something as a little bit as a wild take on this, but I don't think changing the health bars and the ratio to healing is actually going to help, because they've done this. It's not double the health bars, but I think they've done it maybe 2 or 3 times now already. And I think the problem with that is twofold. First, The way that they design the damage, in order to make healers heal, they need to make the spiky damage, which is going to hit you for a lot. And then if your heals are not strong enough, as Shah said, it doesn't feel good because you cannot top people up. And then as the keys go higher, I mean, they scale up. So people are gonna start getting hit for more, etc. So it eventually is going to end up feeling as it feels right now, just because the damage in higher keys is just so much more than compared to low ones. So I don't think that's the solution. Maybe they need to figure out some smarter way to design mechanics. And again, this is something we're asking for. But then I was always saying, let's have some mechanics that the DPS needs to handle. And it's clear that if they failed, they failed. So they did the Skarmorak boss in Stonevolt, where they have to figure out how to kill the orbs without killing everybody else. And I had a lot of wipes and a lot of brick keys there because they would kill all the orbs at the same time, and that's not healable. But it is the healer's fault, different topic. So yeah, I think the solution lies into designing better mechanics, and I don't think there's like one way to say, okay, this is the way you should do it. But maybe they need to think a little bit about that, because there are a lot of dungeons that feel very punishing for different reasons, and it ends up that people are just avoiding those dungeons. They just don't want to do them. If you're doing your weekly key, it's very unlikely that you're going to say, oh, I want to do City of Threats. You're going to look for something easy as Mists of Tyrannusite or something like that. So having said that, are there specific keys that tanks are avoiding and you never want to go and tank them?
Grimbatol for sure.
Grimbatol.
Grimbatol has outrageous tank busters, especially if you don't have spell block.
Yeah.
As a Brewmaster Monk, there are some abilities in there that just humble me every time I'm in there. I don't really know any other keys. Like I generally will, even when I'm just pugging, now that I'm kind of like chilling this season for a couple weeks during this holiday time, I pug most keys. The only key that I really hate is Necrotic Wake, but that's not a tank thing. That's just I can't stand groups in Necrotic Wake.
Yeah.
You know, you get to a Necromancer and know everyone's AoEing and not trying to focus it down. So then you have 3 Frostbolt volleys going off. People don't kick or knock in ads on a Marth, and the people don't. Even now, it's so strange that you're like on Stitch Flesh and they don't aim the hook at the stage. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not coming here again. I would say, besides Grimbatol, I would say most dungeons are pretty tame in terms of like how tanks play it. Some pulls act like just wreck us, but that's when we have our defensives, and then some pulls are super chill and you just kind of just sit there and you do your rotation. And I think Blizzard's done a pretty good job at balancing this dungeon pool. I'm a little nervous for the next one because it's normally there's just more than one painful dungeon for tanks. So we'll have to see.
Okay. Well, I think there's more than one dungeon that the healers can complain, but that's a different topic. Having said that, the healers usually have a sentiment of, ooh, I like healing this tank a lot, and I don't want to play with this other type of tank, and I mean class-wise, because they take too much damage, and I don't like healing them. For example, for me, this season, for example, bears were taking some enormous amounts of damage, and I had a lot of trouble healing them. Obviously, depends on the player as well. While paladins are just sitting there, even if they get into trouble, they can heal themselves and bubble and everything. Is there a similar sentiment when you play a tank? Is there like healers that you prefer to play with and others that you want to avoid because they don't do a good job in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I've always found the kind of class synergy aspect of this game extremely interesting. I main Brewmaster, as I mentioned earlier, but this tank is really unique because unlike wanting to play with like a Disc Priest or I guess like something that provides a pretty massive DR, we really enjoy playing with first off Resto Druids because it just hots work really well with Stagger. On top of that, something that a lot of players don't know is how preservation works with Brewmaster. The way that something like your Reversion and Golden Hour work, it like double dips on how we take damage and we convert it to Stagger. And so your Reversion and Golden Hour, that's all you need. You keep that on us, you time dilate us whenever you feel like it, and we're going to be vibing the whole key. So Preservation is actually a super kind of like sleeper pick. If you're making a comp as a Brewmaster, and you need like something like Lust, or you just want like you don't have an AUG and you want that toolkit, playing Prez is like absolutely insane, and it's much more efficient than Resto Druid because Restored has to apply 4 or 5 hots to you to keep you healthy, and they have to maintain that. Now it's fairly free. They maintain that, and they can just do kitty weaving or whatever. But preservation, man, no, that thing is insane. Outside of that, there isn't a ton of really interesting like healer tank synergy that I can think of off the top of my head. Like Blood DKs prefer healers that can provide them a large DR. So Disc Priest, notably, in past seasons, being able to paint up them when they're low on runic power or going into a pool when they get set up, because Blood DK has a tremendous amount to set up when they go into a pool, unlike some other tanks. Same with Vengeance Demon Hunter. They want something similar to Blood DK. They need time to get set up. They need their Fiery Brand to spread. But yeah, outside of that, I think most people are chilling. One sleeper healer that I really actually like playing with on most of my tanks is actually Holy Priest, despite them not being the strongest healer. Their little angel wings that they give you, or guardian. What's it called? Guardian Spirit.
Guardian Spirit,
Yeah.
right?
200%.
Guardian Spirit.
Yeah.
It's such a strong cooldown, especially on like Brewmaster, even because Brewmaster staggers all their damage. So like utilizing that cooldown, they're probably not going to die when it's on them. They're taking more healing, and it's just like a 1 minute thing you could just throw on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't proc. Playing with me though, it's gonna proc. It's gonna proc a lot. But yeah, those are kind of like off the top. I like playing Bear. I think like I used to main Bear back in the day. They preferred like Holy Paladins. I don't know if that's changed. But generally you want a healer that can kind of fill in the gaps or what you struggle with as a tank player. So if you're a tank who needs a little bit more time setting up a pull, you want something that can provide you a DR or some quick burst healing at the start of the pull. Things like Brewmaster's really niche because of how stagger works, but you want healers that can either provide a lot of hots or very effective hots to you. So even Shaman's pretty good. Earthshield and Riptide alone can keep a Brewmaster pretty healthy, and then your Mastery obviously like super triple dips on their health being low all the time. So your heals are more effective per mana spent. So yeah, those are some of the combinations off the top of my head that I can think of.
Okay. And then a little bit of a weird question, but since you play all the tanks, when you play healer, there's a lot of variation because when you play different healers, there's like melee healers, there's range healers, there's reactive healers, there's preemptive healers, so there's all kinds of the different gameplay styles that you can engage in. While the tank is always standing there, you're in melee and you have to get aggro on all of the mobs, and that kind of seems that basically is everything that the tank does. So does tank gets boring from that perspective, or the different tanks have enough variance in their rotation in the way that they play to keep you entertained when you switch in different classes?
The one thing I'll always praise Blizzard for is their ability and their execution on designing these tanks up to this point. Not only do all the 6 tanks feel different to play, obviously the role's the same. Your goal is to get mobs, get hit in the face, and live. But the way that you deal damage, the way you set up pulls, the way you like run through your mitigation, it all feels different. From how Prot Warrior mitigates most of their damage up front by maintaining and just being a spurg by spamming shield wall, ignore pain. Unfortunately, they're getting some pretty big rage nerfs going into 11.1, but you swap over to Brewmaster and all of a sudden your whole profile is taking a lot of damage and mitigating it through your dot called Stagger, which is like your goal is to not die from that. So you're playing this like little mini game of trying to balance between death and not death through your Stagger dots. Paladin obviously feels extremely fun to play. Not just the rotation's pretty straightforward, like you just gain holy power and you spend it on shield and righteous, but playing a minigame of standing your consecration, making sure you're targeting the right enemies with Avenger Shield to make sure you're getting kicks, and then obviously using externals, which is something that a lot of tanks don't have, but having things like Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Protection, especially now, like not only do you have dispels that you can utilize, but some people forget that Blessing of Sacrifice removes poisons and diseases and makes you immune to them. So you can immune a ton of mechanics using that ability. So all the tanks feel very different to play, and that's probably why it doesn't really get boring. And so yeah, I've been enjoying it, and that's why I try to play all the tanks to kind of keep perspective. And you sometimes will learn how to set up different pulls in different ways. If I play DH and how I set it up a pull here, that might translate a little bit to how I set it up on a Brewmaster, or maybe I get a different idea for that. Which is always just a really fun little game to play, seeing how these tanks kind of mesh. Same with like Spell Reflect, like being like, oh, I can Spell Reflect this, so that means I must be able to AMS this now on DK, so maybe I can utilize that here. So that's always like a fun little game.
Yeah. So if you guys want to play tanks, you have your content creator. Check the links below, by the way. You can find out more about Sha and some guides on how to play tanks. And we're going to have a great season too.
Yeah.
You mentioned you play all the tanks. So what was the experience this season playing olds, gearing them, getting the crests, upgrading the gear? Because they advertised kind of like it's gonna be a very old friendly expansion. But it seems like getting the gear and then getting all the crests and even the Valor Stones, that hasn't been, at least for us, a very enjoyable process. But how was it for you? Did you enjoy that part of gearing and just playing all the tanks?
I'm a pretty big ultaholic, so I definitely enjoyed gearing the tanks. Just the problem is there's this massive disparity between like what a like being on a mythic raid team, filling up vaults like really early on, being able to get tens done very early and getting mythic track gear. The difference between that and then kind of starting either a tank late or maybe not being as proficient on it or just not having the time. I was working a ton of hours at the start of the season, so I didn't have time to dedicate to all those tanks. So just now I'm starting to like work on my sixth tank, which feels bad because even though I was trying to like play a couple of the tanks at the same caliber, I noticed that because I didn't mythic grade on my two alts early on in the season, I fell behind fairly quickly. And then because I fell behind on them, I didn't really have the motivation to play. And then people started demanding, higher IO, higher item level. So there's an issue there. I think Blizzard's change to crest acquisition was very good, and unlike the kind of these tank nerfs that we've talked about and some changes that they're implementing and how they're like too late, I don't think the crest change was necessarily too late. Maybe for the season, if you look at it as like an individual instance, sure, it's late, but this is a change that it looks like it's going into the next patch. It looks like Blizzard's trying to figure out that tuning knob. On Dragonflight, you geared way too quickly. And now this first season, you geared way too slow, and it was a pain point for a lot of players, and we're seeing drop off there, Valor Stone acquisition, etc. And I think they're trying to walk it back to where Dragonflight was, or find a good middle ground, which I agree. Dragonflight was too quick, too easy to gear. And you've run into the issue of people would gear so quickly that they wouldn't even know how to play their class yet, even in these higher keys, where now it's like way too punishing. I would say like Warband gear, insanely good. I would be raiding on my main, and then all of a sudden I'd loot a champion level polearm for like my other class, or for my Guardian Druid or whatever. I'd get a Warglaive for my DH. And like that was kind of great. I think Delves also super sleeper. If you just go into a Delve or two a week on your alts and just do that, like you're getting hero track gear. So at any point you can kind of jump in and already be like 613 plus, especially if you're also doing Mythic plus.
Yeah.
There's really interesting gearing systems. I think it's generally more alt friendly, but Valor Stones need to go. And I think they're making good changes to this crest acquisition, because Valor Stones, at their best, you don't think about it. At their worst, it's like the only thing you're trying to farm, and all of these different things in the world, whether it's world quests or even end of dungeon rewards, delve rewards, they reward like nothing. You can't even like upgrade a piece, and then all of a sudden you loot a mythic track weapon from your vault, and you're like, oh, I need 1,500 Valor Stones to upgrade this. This is like now I'm not farming crests, I'm farming Valor Stones at this point, which is just so frustrating.
And you can't even farm them because the world quest gives you 20 and there's like 3 world quests, so you're now at 60. What do we do next?
They need to do something. I don't know if they need to. I've heard takes where people are like, just remove Valor Stones, and that's great, but then it's kind of like, I mean, I don't know if that really fixes anything. What I think they should do is, I know you can convert crests up, but honestly the conversion rate is horrible. But those like weathered crests that we got at the start of the tier, I was sitting on like 800 of them. Why can't we like break those down into Valor Stones? Like, why can't we have like a vendor to like break down crests and give you a set amount based on the type of crest you're breaking down? If you're breaking down like the gilded crest, the mythic track crest now, like that should give you 150 or whatever stones. Like if you break down 15 of them, like it should give you some type of Valor Stones from that. So then you can farm these crests. You have all of this extra stuff from your lower farming experiences because you were spamming +2s or whatever. But now you don't need those crests anymore. So what are they there for? So I think that could be an option to fix Valor Stones, or again, like people say, just remove them. But I think that just removes kind of the additional layer of upgrading gear, and it also affects kind of the casual player base who just stick to world quests.
Okay, so that's an interesting
I'm not really sure on the
take.
solution.
I'll just expand the question here a little bit, because you said it was way too quick to gear in Dragonflight, but wasn't it like, because when I play all the healers, at some point I switched to something that's an alt for me. I learn how to play it relatively quickly. I catch up with all the hero talents, etc. And then I'm stuck into like 5s, 6s, 7s, etc. And I'm just gonna go run 10s, 11s so that I can at least get mythic track gear in my vault. But now I'm kind of like handicapped and bottlenecked by the gear that I don't have, the item level, etc. That progression. So don't you think it was better in Dragonflight where you could gear up faster oats and then you can play the keys that you want to be playing instead you're stuck into this grinding to the lower keys?
I think there's a line that Blizzard's trying to walk, and I generally agree with. I think the experience of gearing up a character in MMO should have some merit to it. I do think that this season was very slow. I generally like for my main, I liked the cadence. I liked that 12 weeks into the season, I was still like kind of hoping for some small upgrades from my vault. Where in Dragonflight, 3 weeks in, I was choosing sockets.
Yeah.
This time around, very slow. I like it a little bit better than how it was in Dragonflight, but I think the changes that they're making going into the next patch look like they're going to be actually well, they've already implemented it, but going into next patch it should feel a little bit better. I think there's a line to walk because I don't necessarily believe that you should be able to just grab a new character, slam a couple of keys, or have some crests, or like now we have these renowned tracks that allow you to pretty much like stockpile crests on new characters. I don't know if you guys have taken advantage of that. I didn't know that until like not recently, but a couple weeks in, I was kind of behind the curve on that. And then I was like, wait, this is broken. I can have an alt get an instant like X amount of crests and 800 Valor Stones that I can instantly go and craft stuff. I didn't even know that you get a hero crest craft if you get to 24. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So like those kind of options for alts are like nice to kind of get you into it. But I think the grind of having to do 2s, 3s, 4s to get the things that you need to gear up your character to get into the higher keys, like I think that is a progression track. I think most players should take on alts, but I think the acquisition of Mythic track gear is like a problem. I think the amount of upgrades Mythic track gear requires, being 6 instead of 4, like it was in Dragonflight, is also an issue. And I think crafting, they're making it a little bit stronger, it seems like, in the next patch, but it was like kind of your last option this time around, which felt horrible. Because if you wanted to craft, it would take your entire week of crests before they've removed the cap. And that felt horrible. So I think like them kind of moving away from those systems, I think is going to get it to a better middle ground for you need to progress the character a little bit, but eventually like you're going to be able to jump in, especially because you're getting discounts on crests and Valor Stones from your main to be able to gear up your alts quickly.
Yeah, and I think one of the main problems was, as you mentioned, you couldn't obtain Mythic track gear on your odds because everything that you mentioned is actually great. You can get those low-level crests, you can get the crafting tokens for hero track gear, and that would get you pretty high into the gearing process, so you can basically skip 2s and 3s, etc., and you can start doing 5s and 6s, etc. But then, because you cannot get Mythic track gear, you're basically stuck at that level for, at least in my opinion, way too long. And maybe one other way to fix that is that Blizzard is introducing dinars back in the new patch. From what we understand right now, you're going to be getting 2 dinars in the renowned track of that new reputation we're getting. Probably pretty late in the season, but that's also something I would be asking for because first, I would assume this is going to be an item that's going to be able to upgrade to a mythic track, and then it might be those items that you're missing and you cannot farm because, let's say, you don't rate, so you have no way to obtain your spy masters, or something that's just eluding you and you keep farming it and it never drops. So I would assume that it's going to be positive for tanks and for everyone as well to have the dinars. But let me just ask you, is that something that you are looking forward to as well?
Yeah, dinars are always they always have been a good system. I think they were underdone in Shadowlands. I think they were overdone in Dragonflight. I don't think we needed that many purchases, but it was nice to be able to go and buy transmog and stuff. So there's some I have some opinions there, but I think the dinar system. I can't tell because this renown track, what the first one's coming in at like what 17 or something like that. But if we're getting one renown a week, that's that's months into the expansion, or the patch,
Usually we
which
start like you never get like one renown at the start. So usually the first few levels are quite quick. So I would say we would start like in 5 or 6 because you do some quests and they give you a lot at the start, right? So we're probably gonna start like 5 or 6 in the first weeks, and then I don't know, maybe if it's 1 week, then what is gonna be that like 3 months to the first dinner? Yeah, that sounds
I
a
think
lot.
it's a little too long. I think most people would stop playing after about maybe 2 months, I would
Yeah.
say, like 8 weeks of raiding, especially if you're not someone who necessarily raids on a raid team and you're just pugging keys, you're probably getting pretty burnt after a few weeks, or if you're just like, yeah, if you're just pugging the raid. The dinar system's great, but the only problem I have with the dinar system is if there are items that you just like don't necessarily care about. This time around for tanks, I can only think of one notable item from the raid, which was the Sworn Lord's Authority, which is from Silken Court. Your chances of you killing it on Mythic, um, probably fairly low compared to like the majority of the player base. And then like there's really no other items that it's like worth using a dinar on, so it's kind of just like maybe a little bit of catch up gear. So if the trinkets are amazing in this next season, or maybe there's some cool cantrip effects like on a ring or on weapons that we've seen in the past, dinars are awesome. But at its worst, dinars are just like this kind of random pity currency, which I do like when there's good gear, but if I don't like it when there's like no gear to be had. And if it existed in this season, I don't think I would have cared for it. I know every other person probably would, because they don't have spy masters or they don't have a certain trinket or fist weapon from Kai'Veza, but I don't think anything I'm wearing outside of tier is from the raid, and most of it was from Mythic Vault into Catalyst. So
Okay. You mentioned raiding, so let me ask you, how was raiding for you? I would assume you're tanking in the raid, right? What was the experience for you being in a CA guild? Did you kill Queen already, by the way?
we just started Queen Prog this week,
Okay.
but it's weird because of the holidays. So we had a rough week, but we just killed Silken. Did we kill? I can't remember if we killed Silken this week.
Okay.
But we just started Queen. Queen's so far a very fun fight. We are kind of getting into the first intermission, but tank like this raid tier, I really liked it, but it just felt bland. Like for tanks, the big thing you look at in terms of enjoyment is like what are the tank busters and what is the boss positioning. And you have all these bosses that it's like Olgarax, you just kind of you taunt swap on one. And you keep the boss wherever he's at. You let the group run away. Same thing with Bloodbound Horde was kind of interesting because you had to you had to set the beams up so you wouldn't kill your group. But there's like a set pattern to that. But again, you taunt on one, Sikran, you get hit twice, and then there's a different hit you get hit. Like everything was like a taunt on one basically the entire tier, and most of the time the positioning was pretty static, or you would just be moving in a circle around the room. So it's like not enjoyable. So this tier wasn't anything like to write home about, but I did enjoy raiding. But I mostly raid, so I get gear for Mythic Plus because I just love Mythic Plus.
Okay. And what was, because I think Jay, you're also on Mythic Court right now. You're progressing there.
Well, yeah, we're progging me at the court
Yeah,
right now.
we also killed Kai'Veza, so we are there as well now. But we actually had two pretty bad experiences in the raid. One was the Brute Twister, where we spent multiple nights setting up weak auras and just staring at the screen, not pulling the boss, because everybody had to be on the same page and everything had to work synchronized with everything. Yeah.
Good
So,
old weak aura checks. Yep.
I guess that was bad for tanks as well, because I don't think anyone enjoyed that part.
No one. I don't think anyone enjoyed that, but I'll be honest, I was probably just watching Netflix.
Yeah.
I was just looking at my other monitor. I'm not sure what most. I mean, I think most guilds end up doing a 2-tank strat, but we did a 3-tank strat, and I was the 3rd tank. So all I did was I just hit the boss and just picked up spiders. So for me, that boss, like I didn't really need the weak ores because I wasn't breaking eggs.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna lie, I kind of blanked out on that fight a lot.
Oh, so if you're a 3rd tank, you get, I guess you get to interrupt a worm or something. That's everything that you do.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, sometimes I'll throw in a kick, sometimes I don't. We'll see.
All right,
leave it up to chance.
so that was because usually the raid is pretty good in overall, like in design, like as an experience. But this fight killed a lot of joy in many people. And now we are in Silken Court. Obviously, you killed that already, but the initial, because we just started progging it, now the holidays kind of prevent us. But my initial take on this is there's like this 35 slide presentation, and every slide is like a position you have to be in a certain specific point at the fight. So you basically have to like memorize them, and everybody has to like move in conjunction with each other. So it's not like you have to set up the weak cores, but it's kind of like the same experience. It's just PowerPoint slides at this point, which doesn't seem to be that enjoyable either. Is it a hard fight for a tank, Mythic Court?
So I wish I had the credentials to speak on this because I'm just kind of like the guy who gets hit, and I just go where my raid lead tells me. But
Yeah.
the fight for a tank like isn't very difficult. There's essentially two strategies for tanking specifically. It's either having both of your tanks in the same group, which is not what we did. We had our tanks in actually swapped groups. So one tank was red, and I was on the I think I was blue team.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I was blue team. And so like the only thing you're really caring about is if you have a tank who can dispel themselves, and I'm playing Brewmaster, which I can. I'm just solo tanking this tall skinny guy, the Takaj, and the big guy is just you taunt on one and you try to keep them stacked. So like again, it's like just a fairly boring fight for tanks. There isn't a lot of danger, and if you do mess up the taunt swap for some reason, if you don't taunt off of the other tank within like 20 seconds of that cast happening again, you're just gonna get one shot, and then it's like noticeable. So there's no real challenge because again, it's like a taunt swap one. The positioning is just try to keep them stacked. Later in the fight, like there's some weird spots where it's like, well, we're not going to be attacking this guy, so we're moving him here, or the tank has to like adjust and not hit anyone in the other groups to get them stacked. But it was a pretty tame fight. It was just learning the dance, and that's kind of the biggest part. Is like, yes, it sucks having to like memorize a 35-step dance, but I guess that's kind of what mythic raiding is, especially when you get to that higher end. So when you kind of get there and you just have to break fights down, slides are kind of silly, but if you think about any fight, that's all you're doing is you're breaking down like, okay, this set of mechanics, we're doing this thing, and then once that is done, we do this next thing.
It's just that usually it's not 30 slides; it's much less.
No, it's like 5. Yeah, it's definitely I really enjoyed the fight actually. We killed it I think in like 100 and I want to say like 150 pulls.
I think that's pretty good.
It wasn't anything like it. I was a little, now don't get me wrong, like we got to it a couple weeks ago, and then we saw like those massive nerfs the other week. And obviously the ring wasn't super big because no one could get their gems when we raided and killed it, but the ring helped a bit, and I think it's going to help a lot of people even more because it's only going to get better as the weeks go on. You're also getting the kind of like the severed strands buff.
Yeah.
So we killed the boss before we had to do the last set of dispels in the third phase, which meant that the third phase was a joke. So the hardest part of the fight is kind of learning actually phase 1.
So you're giving us some hopes here because we're
no, it's a good fight. So so you just started it?
Yeah, we just started, like we're just figuring things out, how to rotate, etc. So we're basically just getting to the second charge now. So very early days for us. But we only had like 2 nights to prog it, and with all the nerfs and all the buffs that are coming, I guess it's something that we can just get over to and just get to Queen. Let me ask you something though. You said it's kind of like boring to be a tank in this tier. What would be an example of interesting tank tier in raids? What would be like interesting mechanics and interesting fights that you enjoy doing in the raid? Because from the healer's eyes, when we look into the raid, the tanks are always just sitting there, man. Yeah, they probably need to taunt swap at some point, but there's not much else that they need to be doing.
The thing that I like to look at, and I've only been tanking for a few tiers now in raid. I used to be a healer main, actually, believe it or not.
Okay.
And so I used to be healer main. I would like off spec DPS. I was kind of in that like weird 4/5th healer role. So if we needed 5 healers on a fight, I'd heal. If not, I would DPS, or I would be chilling on the bench. But in tank fights, I really like when there's agency for the tanks to kind of decide when they need to taunt swap. Whether it's because they so last year, a good example was like Agira and Admir Jasil. I guess 2 tiers ago technically, because we had the faded season. This was a fight that you generally it was a ramping bleed that would keep stacking up to 15, and then eventually, like, I don't know if it capped or if it phased. I can't really remember, if I'm being honest, but basically when you played, depending on what tanks you were playing with, you would actually choose to taunt swap at different times. You can taunt swap at like as early as like 6, but you could also have the one tank just go to 15 if they wanted to, which was kind of fun for like, I tanked with a Bloody K, so he really wanted to push his kind of throughputs. I think actually a lot of bosses in Amir or so were kind of interesting. You had when you have the tank has to do a mechanic, so on like Nimue or Naimu or however you say it, you would get hits, and then you would have to run your kind of like blossom out away from the group, and then that's when the other tank would swap off. So it wasn't necessarily just like you get hit and then like you take damage and you have to swap because then the next hit will make you take more damage. It was more of like you got hit by this thing and then you had to go and do a mechanic, or you have agency over when you get to taunts. Those are kind of like 2 things that I look for in terms of like tank busters that are more enjoyable than just like regular kind of what this tier is. Or what I really like is like very specific positioning. So like fights like Smolderon. I keep using Imagesoul because it's the most recent raid in my memory, but Smolderon's positioning was like fairly specific. You would get hit by the tank buster, you'd have to go and do something, but you'd also have to adapt based on where like the pools would be spawning, as well as obviously the raid group need to be clean with their positioning as well. But you would have to kind of adapt your positioning of the boss to maximize space for your group. And those fights are always more enjoyable because it changes from pool to pool. When you have fights like this tier, like, I mean, pretty much almost every fight, even like Nexus Princess, there's just a rhythm to it. You keep the boss in the center, you move him next to a mask, you move him back to the center, and like there's no kind of adapting on the fly, and that's kind of what I like because I think it showcases skill. I don't think all players can just be like, oh, this thing is happening this way this time, so I have to make a different decision to kind of fix the problem.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people complain about RNG, and I think that's why they try to make it so like linear, where there's not a lot of variance with what tanks and even with healers with cooldowns. There's not like, you have your wombo combos, right? And so you coordinate for that, but it's the same wombo combo every single time. And so it's like, because then players complain about RNG, but it's kind of nice to have a little bit of creativity and be able to think on your feet. That's probably why I love PvP so much, because it's never the same thing. Yeah, we got our same comp and we compete against similar comps, but at the end of the day, every single fight is a little bit different, and that kind of brings some nice variance. So it would be nice to see them incorporate that in a way that doesn't put players in a place where they feel like, if they don't react exactly right, it's broken. But maybe something with a threshold, like you're saying, where certain stacks line up, or there's different distance things, where if it's further away, it hits harder, if it's closer, whatever things like that. I think it might be make it a little bit more fun for the tanks for sure. Because I agree, I've tanked before, and I used to main tank a long time ago when DKs first came out, and there was some fights that were very unique and creative and fun, and then it just kind of got more, like you said, Tauntaun 2 moved to A and B, and it was just very boring, and that's why I stopped tanking, because there was a lot more kind of creativity and fun with healing for me personally. So
Yeah, I think most players find raid tanking pretty like stale, especially nowadays. And I don't know if it's because it was like the first raid this expansion, and they're like, oh, we're gonna just make it pretty simple for tanks. Or if they're just like, this is kind of the direction they want to do, because I'm not sure, maybe the entire overall design of the fight might be more complicated, like Brood Twister. I'm not really sure. But what was your guys' favorite healing fight then? I've heard Kaiveza was like a banger,
Yeah,
but maybe
that
I'm wrong.
that was definitely my favorite fight. Mostly because for me the mechanics there were kind of interesting to perform, but you actually didn't need weak cores for them, right? And then yeah, I mean all the busters, all the damage going on. Maybe the intermissions were a little bit annoying with all the movement that you had to do there. But that fight was a banger for me. Because also everybody's stacked. I play Restoration Shaman in raid, so if everybody's stacked, I can just drop my healing rain, etc. But for some reason that fight felt amazing. I kind of enjoyed the fact that all the mechanics are basically simple. You just drop the portals there, then you get sucked in, and you just dodge the daggers. But they were made in such a way that it made the fight very engaging. Although it's simple mechanics. While at the same time, you can have some very complicated mechanics in other fights, but they just make it feel chaotic, and it's not enjoyable to do for some reason. But yeah, that's my take. I really enjoyed Kaiveza, and I definitely didn't like Brute Twister. I'm not gonna speak about Court yet, Silken Court, because we're just starting to prog it. But for now, 30 slides also seems a little bit too much for me. Although I hear a lot of Final Fantasy bosses are like that, so maybe we get a little bit of a Final Fantasy experience right now. What about you, Jay?
for me, there's nothing I love, but I can tell you that Rashanon, that platform, that fight, while it's easy, I just don't like all that movement, especially as a priest being slow. I was constantly asking for Warlock Gate and Dragon Grips or rescues, because it was like, man, that even with Feather and Bubble and I just felt so slow. I was always the last one to stack in the pool. So that one I didn't really like. I just felt it was so massive. And maybe some players liked it, like DHs and warriors and paladins that can jump over there quick, or druids even, right? But man, as a priest, it's just like, it was painful. most of the other fights, I mean, I just enjoy healing, so I've done it on druids and I play all the heal. Well, right now I'm really only focused on mostly priest, shaman, and druid. Very limited exposure. But yeah, I mean, I enjoy the raid. It's not like the best, but it's also not the worst. I'm kind of in the middle. I think it's a good first tier, and so far it's been fun.
All right, guys, a little bonus question for Xiao, which is definitely interesting to me. But well, a lot of the content that you do, and once something comes out, once the new dungeon starts out, you come up with routes for those dungeons pretty quickly. What we do as healers usually is like we follow the tanks, we watch some videos, and then we figure out what's effective, what to pull, what to combine, what not to do. But how do you come up with the routes and the ideas there? As soon as the content is out, is there a trick to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You see this happen a lot on live servers for some of the top groups who have to innovate and make improvements. But as someone who doesn't necessarily push at that cutting edge end,
Yeah,
I'm spending a
by
lot
the way,
of time on
they're doing this at the end of the season, right? Those ideas basically evolve as the season progresses. But I seen you come up with routes as soon as like dungeons are out, basically just fresh out of the PTR.
Yeah, it's that's that's what it is, right? So I'm spending a lot of time on PTR, and there's a lot that goes into it. And this is one of my favorite parts about tanking and Mythic Plus in general is when you have a dungeon like Dawnbreaker, and I think Dawnbreaker is probably the only good example this time around, is you look at it and you're like, okay, there's a linear route you have to take, and you have to kill every mob from the start of the dungeon to first boss. But then, like, it's open. Like you have to kill these 3 mini bosses, and what can we pull to structure that makes the most sense? So there's a couple things you want to keep in mind. You're looking at what do these mobs do? Are they causing a ton of group damage? Are they causing a ton of like kind of more or less RNG bolts that are going to just like, if they happen to all connect with 1 DPS, is that person dead? What is the damage profile of what these mobs are doing? There's the other thing that I like to keep in mind is how does this make sense for people who may be in comms or may not be in comms? Again, Dawnbreaker is an amazing example of this. Unfortunately, and I hate this route, but the pug route is go behind through the church and like out then the front door. I can't stand that because I think it's highly inefficient. The mobs there generally will do more damage or cause more problems for your group, and especially in higher keys. The pull cadence is slower, and so that's another thing I like to keep in mind. How big can I pull? Because pulling big for a tank is fun, but I know that pulling big for DPS is even more enjoyable, and sometimes healers enjoy it too because there's like kind of more reactionary healing, as long as it's not going to just one-shot the group or become overwhelming. So you're trying to like balance all these things. Like I want big pulls, but it needs to be like not too overwhelming. I want a route that makes sense, that's efficient. And so I spend a lot of time on PTR kind of calculating like how much damage mobs do, what can you reasonably pull together with any comp. You don't have to have a blood decay, you don't have to have a protection paladin to be able to do these types of things. You don't have to have multiple knocks. So I just kind of spend time figuring that out, and then you're just obviously looking at mob percent. You don't want to go 10% over in a key just for time's sake. So yeah, it's spending a lot of time on PTR and playing around with like different routes and different pulls, killing one mob at a time to figure out exactly how much percent it gives before all of the add-on developers can calculate that. That's generally how I go about it. Is I run the dungeon a couple times. I try some different routes. I review videos. I see what's manageable, what's not. I look at logs. There's a whole lot, but it's something that I take a lot of pride in, I guess, when I'm able to make up routes for people early on to help them kind of alleviate that pain, because I know that's a really scary point for a lot of tanks. And I hate that I get asked it now because I don't think it's true anymore outside of Dawnbreaker, is that most routes are hold W. That's all you're doing. And you can generally hit between 100 and 105%. And if you go a little over, it doesn't matter because sometimes you might be at 99%. You pull a mob that's 4%. It's like, ideally you don't do that. But a lot of tanks, their biggest fear getting into tanking, if they're a DPS player who wants to try it out, is like, I don't know the route. I don't know what I need to pull. And so making routes like that is like a big hurdle that people are able to get over easier when they have a route available to them, and so they can get into practicing each pull instead.
Yeah, you should take a lot of pride of this because it's great content and it's very, very useful. And when you do all of this analysis, do you do it by yourself? Do you have people who are helping you? And on the PTR, are you bugging, or you have people that are basically helping you to figure those things out?
I haven't met someone insane enough to do what I do on PTR. I can't convince any of my friends to jump in there with me, but generally, normally I'm pugging a lot on PTR. Every once in a while, I can convince like a guildie or a friend or some BNet friends to like jump in and do a couple keys with me. But the like analysis of the runs generally is like me looking at my own VODs, looking through logs, and kind of coming up with it more or less myself. But like I can't thank the people who do assist me in the process in terms of like doing the actual runs more, because sometimes when you log into PTR, it's absolutely dead. There's like one group, it's a full Russian group, they don't speak the language, they like there's difficulty when you're playing on PTR like that, because it's just no one really cares. The only people on PTR are a mega tryhards or like content creators essentially. So sometimes it's difficult to find people to work with, but yeah, PTR is really fun though. You get to kind of see the content early.
Yeah, well, I do spend a lot of time on the PTR as well, so maybe we can try to combine forces this time around and figure out something
Yeah, sure.
together.
Yeah, I need a healer, a little pocket healer.
Yeah, for sure.
I will make your life miserable. I will die on the DH a lot.
That's fine, man. This is what the PTR is there for. Just lots of deaths, and but as long as you take it as a learning experience, I think that's how we can benefit from it. Yeah.
That's the best part about PTR. Did you guys, really quick, did you guys have beta access for the War Within?
I did have beta access, yeah. Not alpha, just beta.
Okay.
Not me. I didn't have beta.
Oh, okay. I was gonna ask like how you guys felt about the beta testing, because this time around it was released to basically anyone who bought like the big old deluxe edition or whatever it was called, the legendary edition. I found that the beta testing this time around was miserable.
Yeah.
And I've had beta the last few times, and this time it was beta became live servers, which was extremely frustrating as someone who was trying to like make content and learn so I can like make content for other people.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had that experience or
I don't think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but I'm actually a little bit annoyed by the way they do testing, because for example, when they're testing Mythic Plus, you are capped at a certain gear level, and then the dungeons are scaled what I would presume is different for what goes into the live servers. So they're testing some variation of the numbers, but this variation has nothing to do for when everything actually goes live, because you have a different item level. The dungeons are probably going to be scaled differently. So I think they tune everything for the numbers that they see, and they think that's going to work the same when it goes live. But we had a lot of instances where dungeons are going to be released and they're completely undoable in certain fights, etc. So they have to do some hot fixes to fix all of that, etc. The other thing that they do a lot when they're testing, they do many changes that are not communicated. So, for example, when we were testing Mists of Tyrnaside, you go and you do it because you know the dungeon from Shadowlands, and it was kind of like the same for the most part. And then all of a sudden, one day you go in, and then the last boss has the green circle and the suck in, which were two new mechanics that were not there in Shadowlands. But that was not listed anywhere. So people don't know about it. They don't know if they should be testing it again, etc. This is something we found out, but I would assume there are a lot of other changes that happen on the PTR that are not communicated, and maybe people don't even find most of them, and they're able to give feedback from that perspective. Which is why they have to do so many hot fixes and so many patches once everything is released to fix those issues that are not instantly obvious when they're doing the PTR. So yeah, I think they can definitely improve a lot from that perspective and do much better in the PTR sessions, so that once they release something, it's actually in a much better state and it's much more playable.
Yeah, it's there's definitely a lot of things that they need to improve on when it comes to like implementing changes and stuff. I believe, actually, I know what change you're talking about. I don't remember if it happened and then they made they eventually did make a post about the change, the coalesce or whatever it's called on Tredova. But yeah, I remember when I was in there, I was like, wait, I was like getting ready to kick the parasitic mind or however the old mechanic worked.
Yeah.
And then it like never happened. And then randomly it just started like sucking us in, and it was kind of like unexpected, but also what an amazing change. The old way that worked, it was horrible. You had to like manage your kicks the entire fight.
Yeah.
So I was really happy with that change. But my big problem with beta testing specifically was because so many people were able to buy in access to it, the people who would queue up for keys queued up as if they were live keys. So they would queue up, they would wipe on the first pull, and they would leave.
Oh yeah, that happened
And
a
so
lot.
that was never the case. I remember during Dragonflight beta, and I was a degenerate, and that's kind of like when I really started going hard on YouTube. Is I would be streaming for like 12 hours a day, but like when you got into a queue with people, you were in that key until all of you unanimously decided that okay, we've wiped enough to the first boss of Ruby Life pools. We can leave. But this time around, it was just like impossible to even try to see later in the dungeon when you were pugging. And I hope that they address that differently when it comes around to midnight, especially because they're doing a faster cadence of these expansions. But holy cow, if they do that again, it's going to be it's just difficult for content creators to actually make content and figure out what they need to do for, the dungeons.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that I guess changed a little bit is now they're listening more. So maybe we can provide that as a feedback, and they'll listen and somehow try to improve the process in general.
Yeah, but then there's shareholders who want more money, so they want people to pay $90 for
Yeah,
the
yeah.
deluxe edition. Like
That's
there,
also true.
there's definitely people I know who bought that edition so they could have beta testing. And like, don't get me wrong, I played with those people; they were like good beta testers. But there's also people who bought it just to, yeah.
Yeah, I mean
they
that
weren't
was
maybe
a sell
ethical.
point for me, because you also get like 3 days early access on the actual release. So
I made my money back from that early access for
yeah.
sure. I farmed so much gold those first 3 days.
That's true. That's true. But the point is that they're
Yeah.
giving you those incentives, so people are gonna jump in regardless, and then they
Uh-huh.
might not know what they're jumping into, because, as you said, they perceive the beta as live keys, which
Exactly.
is definitely nothing even close to reality. So yeah.
It's very unhealthy for a testing realm to be treated like a live server.
Yeah.
That's kind of, I think, the big. They could probably just take away they could give early access but take away beta, and I don't think a lot of people would care that much.
Yeah.
Some people would, but I think it'd be the minority of players.
Yeah, I think the 3 day early access is gonna be plenty for people to give those extra $90 or whatever it is, and then we can keep the beta a little bit cleaner. Okay. We've been keeping you here for a while, but I have to poke your mind for one more topic. There was a recent article that Blizzard released, which was not by Blizzard. It was just speculation. What if Mythic Plus used DATs instead of a timer? And I think that was caused by the fact that we had an announcement that keys are not going to deplete below 12 in the next patch. So I guess people started speculating, what if, the Mythic Plus dungeons are now going to be similar to Delphs, and instead of having a timer, you're going to have a set number of deaths that you're allowed. And there were a lot of pros and cons about those. Our personal take has been that if that happens, that basically needs to be a completely different game mode. They should keep Mythic Plus with the timer, and if they want to allow this should be like a separate IO score, separate type of progression that you need to be doing. But what is your take on this? Are you for it, against it, or somewhere in the middle?
When I saw this, I was immediately against it, only because if you just take kind of the words and insert it into how Mythic Plus works currently, instead of having a timer, it's like you have, I don't even know how many deaths. Like, let's say after 10 deaths, key's done. It's a failed key. There's then this problem where you're no longer up against the timer and there's no rush. So why would you not just take one pull at a time? Why wouldn't you CC hard mobs out? Why would you not just wait for Lust to come up 7 times and spend 2 hours in your plus 10 Grim Batol? So obviously there's a whole slew of issues that come with just implementing a death counter versus a timer in Mythic Plus currently. But like you just said, I think how most players feel about this is if it was a separate game mode entirely. The way that I see this being implemented is if they were ever to reintroduce some type of like challenge mode-esque run, where it's more like in an MDI style format, where you have this key is going to be set at a plus 10 every single time. You have 10 deaths and you need to go as fast as you can to incentivize rewards, similar to how challenge modes worked way back in Mists of Pandaria. And the rewards wouldn't be necessarily like IO, but they would be, I don't know, like cool recolors of certain sets, or maybe some kind of specific like class set, similar to what we saw in, over 10 years ago now in Mists of Pandaria. So I would see this more like challenge modes if they did implement this. I can't see how it would possibly work in the current format of the game. And if they do insert this, I would like it to be a separate game mode.
Yeah, for sure. And going back, like I've done some delves in groups in the beginning when they released them. And if you wiped, that actually felt pretty bad because I think in delves you have like 5 or 6 lives altogether. It's not even 10.
That's it, yeah.
So one wipe, you're done. And
Yeah.
that is going to be very punishing specifically for you and us because as we already talked about it earlier, our mistakes usually cause the full wipe. So, if we mess up something, you're done, It's not like just step into the puddle and died. If you mess up, you wipe the whole group, so that's probably most of your lives. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting speculation, but maybe if it's a different, separate game mode, then maybe people can enjoy that if they want to, and we can keep Mythic Plus as it is right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because they mention how like it would try to reduce toxicity in keys because you wouldn't be up against a timer, but I think it would
Yeah.
make it more toxic.
Oh, for
Wouldn't it make
sure.
it more toxic? Someone dies and
Yeah.
you just start instantly getting flamed because
They didn't
you
stand.
costed them.
Yeah.
It's like, oh man.
Yep.
It's just I don't think there's not a lot of pros to this unless it is a separate game mode, in my
I
opinion.
agree. Yeah.
But it could be enjoyable because I do think Mythic Plus right now is extremely linear and it's getting bland. We've had it now since Legion. They've made some good adaptations to it over the years, some for better, some for worse. But I think there needs to be a change, and I think another game mode similar to what they've been doing in PvP. I think solo shuffle being introduced. Was that Dragonflight or was that back in Shadowlands? I don't remember.
That was there here now.
The solo
That's in War
shuffle.
Within. Yeah, Solo Shuffle War Within.
Oh no, I mean like didn't they add the solo queue for arenas like
Oh
last
yeah,
expansion?
sorry. Yeah, you're right. Dragonflight. They did the Blitz. The Blitz
The
was the new
Blitz,
one.
yeah.
before. Yeah.
So they added solo shuffle a couple
Yeah,
last expansion, and they
Dragonflight.
added Blitz now, and I think what I like about that, and maybe this kind of leans into talking about potentially like a solo queue system, but what I like is that your rating in those game modes are separate than if you were going into a 3v3 or rated RBGs, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. Obviously solo queue works extremely different than how a 3v3 arena works, but
Yeah.
you have a separate rating and a separate score, and you can kind of pursue whichever game mode you want. You meet some people playing solo shuffle, or you meet some people via the group finder, and you want to go from solo shuffle to 3v3. You're not hurting your solo shuffle score for playing in 3v3 and vice versa.
Yeah.
Which I think is extremely interesting, and I've been cooking for a while on if they were to introduce a solo queue system, what they could do. But yeah, are there any more thoughts about the death counter? How do you, as a healer, what would you guys think about a death counter? Like, would you feel like there'd be more responsibility on you or less, or?
Yeah, I think some of their personal responsibility I think is important. I think that when it comes to deaths, it happens in keys all the time, and it's like you said, when it's a DPS, it really doesn't matter. It's like, oh, we'll either B-res them right now, or we'll just wait till after we clear this pack, save the B-res for a boss, because that same person's probably gonna die. If it's a tank, it's pretty much a wipe for the most part. And if it's a healer, if you have good DPS, can heal themselves or tank, wogging or whatever, then you might be okay. But I think you already nailed it. I think Wolvy mentioned this on one of the other ones too. It'd have to be a separate game mode altogether because we're too locked in right now on how Mythic Plus works. I think going back to the whole queue thing, like the solo queue, I think that'd be great, especially if you're rating adjusted. If keys depleted, I see people getting mad about that, but I think it'd be an interesting twist to that system. But yeah, the death thing, it would just have to be a different system, in my opinion. Totally different from Mythic Plus.
I'll
sure.
just add that experience that I had in Delves because at the very start of the season, I didn't know if it's better to go solo. So I was like, let's go into a group. There were a few occasions. So one of the groups, the tank we just butt pulled some extra stacks, extra packs on top of us. So we ended up wiping. As soon as we wiped, everybody was out because we were out of lives. So that was pretty unpleasant. Then there was another run that I remember. We just went in. There was like a fronto or something. So our rogue died. Then he came back. He ate another fronto. He died again, and everybody just left. Like we were not out of lives yet, etc. But they were just like, "Oh, we're not dealing with Joe here, who's gonna be eating the frontos because we know how this is going to end. So let's just save our time right now and get out of the delve." So like I think I had more negative experiences in those few delves that I tried as a group than positive ones, and I think this is only going to get worse if there's like kind of like in Mythic Plus, if they're getting harder and harder, and there's like higher keys or whatever they decide to call them. So yeah, if it's a separate game mode and people know what they're going in for, and you want to do this and you want to deal with Joe and butt pulling, it's going to wipe you, that's fine. But if they replace Mythic Plus with that, I don't think they're going to do it. But if they do it, that's probably going to be a huge step back. So yeah, hopefully that's something that they experiment with first, so we can give them feedback and they can figure out how to implement it in game. All
I
right.
wonder what the best way to do would to test that actually.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
same as the solo queue, because you mentioned that. I would like to see something being tested out, because in my mind, solo queue is basically going to be the same. It would solve some problems, but then it could cause different problems. So I'm kind of disappointed, because we had season 4 in Dragonflight, which I don't even consider a season, because there was absolutely no new content there. But that was the golden moment for them to test something crazy, because nobody was playing and nobody was interested to play for whatever reasons. So they could have done something wild and say, okay, this is an experiment. You know, it's a dead season. Go see how it's going to work out. They were going to get some feedback on it, but unfortunately they didn't. So yeah, maybe they'll do it at the end of the War Within. We'll have to wait and see.
It's so random, because in PvP they do it. They have like a whole separate thing in PvP that's like a completely separate thing, that's where Blitz came from. They tried it in like the regular season just as like a random thing, and they got good response from it, and then they introduced it, right? And so they could do that. They could add another little thing inside of Mythic or whatever, like just another little queue section that was like, oh, this week we're trying like a solo queue for, and it doesn't have to like compete with or completely change Mythic Plus. It could just be another little thing. And it was completely like, we're testing it. You get rewards for doing it, and that's all you get. Like there wasn't like a ladder or anything like that. It was just like, try it out and see if you like it. And they got feedback from it, so
Yeah,
they could do something.
Because those new modes that they tested in PvP, they all started like as a casual mode, right? That there was no rating, there was nothing connected to it, no rewards.
You just got rewards.
So they can definitely try to do something with the PvE stuff as well. I don't think anyone's gonna get mad, and then all of a sudden you discover something new and everybody's happy and rejoice.
Exactly.
So what's your take on solo queue?
Okay, so have you got how much? I don't even know where to start. Okay, you are a one game Andy, as you like kind of just mentioned, and I am too. But have you played Diablo 3? Maybe Diablo 4, but I guess. So do you remember how?
I think I played both of them, but just a little bit.
Did you ever play did you ever get to like the end game where you were playing Rifts?
No.
Where you would go into like
no,
the
no.
obelisk.
So I played Diablo 3 when they released it, and then I went through like the difficulties, but I don't think there were rifts at that point, so I just quit shortly after that, before they released the rifts.
Gotcha. Okay, so in Diablo, and this is gonna lead into my cook for Mythic Plus. So in Diablo, you have these things called rifts. You basically, I don't know, for example, you'll start at like a rift level 10, and then when you complete that rift, based on how quickly you're able to complete it, or just completing in general, will unlock the next level of rift. And as you go up in rift, you get greater rewards to increase the power level, so then you can keep kind of progressing. So
that's
you get your 12 done, now you have a yes,
Okay.
kind of. But it also goes up indefinitely, but like you'll see people doing rifts like way greater than like 150. So like in terms of numbers, not really, but there's this progression system that you start at the lowest level despite how geared your character is, and then when you complete the rifts in time, or in a certain level of speed, you then unlock the next level. So that's kind of my cook for Mythic Plus solo queue. You have a separate system that isn't attached to the, I guess, like what you would consider like the standard Mythic Plus like group finder now that you do now. You would basically, like the dungeon finder, you would pick a key, and they all start at +2. So let's use next dungeon, I guess next season dungeons, for example. So you want to queue up for a +2 mother load, and you go in, you get grouped with like the 5 people, everyone accepts, everyone enters the key. There's a 3-minute kind of waiting room, I guess, where you're in that bubble at the start of the key, like you would see in any dungeon. Similar to like Battlegrounds too, I guess, because at the start of Battlegrounds, you have to like wait for X amount of minutes before the game starts. And so that's your time to change talents for the dungeon you're in. You can share routes if you'd like to. You can kind of talk, get cordial with the people you're running with. And then the key just starts. Like when that 3-minute timer's up or 2-minute timer or however long they feel like doing, the key starts per usual. You have your timer, you have your death counter. When you finish that key, based on if you 1, 2, or 3 chest it, now you're able to unlock and queue for the higher keys of that level. So now you can go, let's say you +3 it, you can now queue for a +5 mother load. Or if you want to like take it back down and you want to queue for other things, you can farm +4s or +3s. So now if you go into a +5 and you 2-chest it with your pug group that you just queued into, you can now do +7s. And so you keep climbing this individually. But if you're like, now I want to go do, what's another dungeon? I guess the Operation Floodgate. You now have to start at a +2. So you have to time a +2, and based on the level you completed at, like if you 3-chested, that unlocks. So you progress each key individually, which then gives you score for your solo queue, like rating. And then the best part about this is that that rating will also be displayed if you queue up for like the group finder too, if you want to. If you want to make a shift to having a more coordinated group, or you want to try to find a group. Just because you haven't pushed with a group in the past before and you were able to do it through solo queue, someone could see like, okay, this guy's like, I don't know, so I'm going to just use 630 as an example. This guy's 630. He doesn't have any IO score in the pre-made, but he's 3K in solo, which means that he's done all the keys at like a 14 or whatever. So we're going to invite him and take a chance on him because he's proven that he's been able to solo queue up to 3K as an off-meta spec or with whatever. So we're going to be able to invite him. So it might make actually it more friendly for non-meta people to get invites, because oftentimes what I feel like stops people is if you're non-meta, you're not going to get invited. Therefore, you have to do lower keys, which keeps your IO low, which won't get you invited to keys. So it has this like really weird cyclical nature that kind of eats itself almost and causes issue for a lot of players. So my solo queue system is basically a proposal where you progress each key individually. It's kind of like you queue in, and you don't need a key. You don't need to have a +2 key to solo queue up. It's a dungeon that has a modifier on it, basically.
Yeah, and I like that
So, yeah.
because this is basically going to force you to learn the dungeons, progressing them, step by step. Because we kind of mentioned that, let's say you can go get your gear from Delphs and then you feel like you're ready to jump into Mythic Plus because you have the item level gear, but you start straight from 6s and 7s and you don't know the mechanics. Now, this is going to basically make you learn the dungeons when they're easy. You can see how everything is, lay out in the dungeon, what are the mechanics, even if they don't hit very hard. And then once you do that, you're basically allowed to progress to the next level. And now that you know the mechanics, they're, hitting harder, but now you also know how to deal with them. So I think that's a very good take on the solo queue system.
I think it solves a lot of issues, right? Like it solves,
Yeah.
okay, I'm a non-meta spec and I want to queue up. I don't want to sit pugging in Group Finder for 35 minutes as a DPS trying to get into a key. It solves that issue as well. And yeah, like you just said, it is another way to have like almost a proving ground style relationship with dungeons where you have to progress through. You can't just jump in based on your item level to a +10. Now, don't get me wrong. If you have guildies who want to carry you through a +10 key and they have one and you want to use like the Group Finder to find people, you can. But this is a way for people to learn mechanics. They have to queue up for it to get score. And it's an alternative way for people who don't like to really interact with the Group Finder, because there's a lot of it. I mean, there's good things about the Group Finder, but there's a lot of bad things about the Group Finder that deter players from doing Mythic Plus and partaking in a relatively fun system, because they get kind of stopped. They get like bottlenecked at it pugging into keys or trying to pug into keys.
Yeah, and if
So
that's,
I don't know.
if
I think it's good.
Yeah, if that solves the queue times, which is one of the biggest pain points for the LFG2, and then it makes people learn the dungeons, I think that's all benefits. They should definitely give it a shot at least, and make like a practice run or something at some point.
Yeah, and Blizzard can go further too, because there's a tank, and I would argue there's also a healer issue, because I think DPS is just more enjoyable in this game. But you can also incentivize Valor Stone or Crest Reward bonuses for people who queue up for certain key levels, kind of like how you see like LFR or heroic dungeons even, which is at the start of the patch was this very sleeper way to make money if you were a tank or healer. I made so much money off of those augment runes from those queues, but basically they can implement that into the Mythic Plus system to incentivize more people to tank and heal. And that could be a good or bad thing, if I'm being honest. Some people might just do it just for the bonuses and they might be really bad. Or it might incentivize more people to actually want to play those roles, and it could actually make queue times, if anything, quicker. But yeah, I don't know. This is something I've been kind of like thinking about for a very long time, ever since like Dragonflight Season 3, when people kind of started whispering about a solo queue system. and I like it. I think it's.
Is there any negative? Is there in that system? Are you thinking of a negative system as well, like negative points for people that leave or things like that, like they do in PvP?
They could do a punishment. They could do a punishment if someone leaves early. I've thought about maybe a system where you have to, like a prompt pops up when you queue in, where you have to accept that if you leave before a certain amount of time has passed in the queue, like you have to stay here for 25 minutes and you have to hit accept. And if you hit decline, well, it might punish you, or it might just kick you and just find someone else to replace him. But if you hit accept and you leave before the 25-minute mark, you might lose rating, or it might knock you down from the level of, like, let's say you're trying to do a 7 mother load and you just like leave because you don't, like, someone wiped on the first pull. Now you can only queue for a 6. So now you have to climb your way back up again. And like that could also be a way to punish people. I don't know if removing score is ever the best thing to do, but I think punishing the or just you can't queue again for 30 minutes. I don't know. Like they already have that system in play. A big problem with the current dungeon design is that because it's a group made outside of like an instance based kind of group finding system like LFR or heroic dungeons, is that the game can't punish you if you just leave, whether you leave after the first pull or whether you leave after like just a wipe that you as a player be like, I don't think we can time this key, despite your group probably being able to time the key, which is more often than not people are really bad at making that judgment call. I think they could implement a system like that to deter people from leaving. And what's cool about it is you're going to see probably some insane players in that content, and you might end up playing with some like either high-rated players who are just like doing keys to farm crests quickly, or you might just be like, I've never seen a feral druid or a devastation evoker being able to do this much damage, but now I do. And I don't know. I think it's a cool way to like showcase more classes and because there's also this issue where it's like, like talking to like larger content creators could always be a bad thing because they're playing at the high end, and so like their opinions are extremely they're shifting more towards that higher end of play and like what is considered meta. So a lot of people watch them because they're good, and because they're good, they have opinions that really only relate to the top end of players. And so they're like, oh yeah, you have to play with an in-hand shaman and an og and a boomkin or whatever it might be. And so now everyone who's listening, despite their skill level, thinks that I have to play with an og, a boomkin, and an in-hand shaman in my key. And so then that obviously creates this dilemma where now people who are very good at their spec can't get into even like average keys because there's this whole issue with the meta. I remember when Og was introduced, don't even get me started. I remember queuing up for like +10s and people were like, Og S Priest Mage, and I'm just like, it's a 10. it's a 10 when the highest keys being done were like 27s. It's like, what are we doing? And so I think it solves a lot of that. Don't get me wrong, there's like an issue of when you are in a queue like that, you really can't partake in any other type of content because it'll remove you from the queue or pause your queue, or like you can't like queue up for other content essentially because you're stuck in that that group finder instance. I don't know what it's technically called, but you're kind of in like limbo. Like that's one downside I could think of, but outside of that, like I think Blizzard has a little bit more agency to punish people in that system. So I think it might help reduce toxicity because people can be punished. Where it's hard to recognize people who are being toxic now because I've left keys. I generally don't, but I've left keys that are going horribly south. Don't get me wrong. I generally will be like, hey, I'm going to do one more pull on this boss. If we can't figure it out, I'm going to leave. Yeah. Or, hey, we're 58 minutes into the Scrim Battle. I think I need to go to bed, you know? But there are people who actively just leave keys as soon as they wipe on the first pull because it didn't go the way that they wanted it to, and that's horrible. Yeah. And I think a solo queue system like this could fix it.
And I think very easy solution is if things start to go south and you're still not at that 25-minute mark or whatever when you can leave, they can just implement like a vote, hey, can we mark this key as completed? And if everybody votes yes, then you can just leave. If not, you committed your 25 minutes and you have to stay for that long.
Yep. So it's like stay for 25 and then like, yeah, similar. I've heard something similar. I don't play League of Legends, but isn't there a thing in League of Legends where like you can group forfeit if you're too far behind or something? I don't play League, so I don't know.
Yeah, 4 people have
so like there could be like after like 30 deaths in a key or after 25 minutes, like your group could unanimously decide to like forfeit the key, and it'll port you out to wherever you were hanging out, whether it's Dornigal or whether it's in the Undermine or whether you're just, I don't know, somewhere in the Ringing Deeps. But basically, yeah, I think Blizzard's agency there could be pretty good, and I'd be very excited to see a system like this. If they were to implement a system like this, I don't know how the testing would be, because they could either introduce it in like a Fated Season-esque thing to try it, which I think would have better results. Because the problem with doing it on PTR is that so little people play PTR for a lot of reasons. First off, it's some people don't want the content spoiled, and that's why they don't play it. Some people, they're checked out of the game already. The season's over for them. They want to just wait till the new content comes out. There's another problem where it's like, well, it's because it's on the PTR. It's a test server, so anything you do there is just, it's not valuable. Like, you don't get rewarded like you did for like time trials. Like, if they did a PTR like banner reward for playing and doing stuff on PTR, I think that'd be cool. But the testing with a system like that, it would be difficult to do short term without doing it probably on live servers. I don't think it would.
They should do it just like Blitz. You know, it's like it was the whole season of like testing it out, and they had different dungeons or like different arenas, I guess, whatever you want to call it. And people loved it. Like I thought it was cool. You can queue up for like a rated battleground, basically, but as a solo or as a duo, and you know, it was super popular. And it's like, okay, right now I'm looking at the quick match, and you could do it, right? Brawl, Temple of Homegroup, not even the actual Blitz, but the Brawl. Like they could do that in Mythic Plus, and just have a quick match and have that whole little section where it's like, okay, solo queue and test out a bunch of stuff. And even if it's like, okay, we're only going to test for 8 weeks, and if you do X amount, you get a mount. People will do it for mounts. People will do it for augment runes. People will do it for all kinds of stuff. So, and like you said, you know, in the PTR, there's not a lot of representation. It's most of those players are like top end players. But what about the 80% of the players that like actually, you know, like are gonna be the ones that feed the system? That's who you need in there. And so just incorporate it into retail, into the actual release state, and see how it goes.
And
Yeah, I think it's easier
I don't
to-
see why they just don't put it in a parallel to what we have right now. So it's just like kind of like an alternative that you have. And if people want to use it, they're going to use it. If they don't have to.
Yeah,
Like, it's not going to be tied to everything. And if they actually do a good job, people will just naturally start to use it all the time,
Yep.
and it's going to take
Yep.
over. You know,
Yep.
It's not
Yep.
like you're risking something. It's just another way to play the game. And if you do a good job, as many things that happened in World of Warcraft before, if you do a good job, people will just like it, and it's going to take over.
Yep, it's true.
Okay.
I think that's probably my biggest wish, though, right now as a player is I think solo queue, especially as someone who doesn't play meta, because Brewmaster's never meta. I think a solo queue system would be very enjoyable. There's also times where I'm just like degenerately playing at 3 a.m, like I am right now, and there's no one on.
Yep.
So solo queue systems will also help. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see a lot of downsides to a solo queue system outside of like the argument that it alienates kind of it turns it into more of like I don't know, like I don't know, I'm trying to think of the word now. Basically like instant simulator where you're just sitting in your main city and just queuing up for whatever you want. But that's kind of how the game works anyways, so I don't really think it matters as much. So
yeah, the queue times will be interesting because I think, you know, it's just like tanks and healers will get quicker queues, but then you incentivize them for queuing up, right? Like you do now. You just incentivize.
That's exactly it. You get to log into a tank and healer, and you get to play content immediately. I can't imagine it's that crazy, because if you do look at Group Finder, it's not like there's a million groups that are all looking for a tank and healer, but there are a couple. But eventually they do fill, or they get delisted. But generally, I don't think the queue times would be all that long, because the problem with like heroic dungeons and LFR. Well, I don't think LFR is extremely popular game mode. Surprisingly, but heroic dungeons, like very few people are queuing up for those dungeons.
Yeah.
Where Mythic Plus, like a lot of people are partaking in it, and I think it would just make it, I think, more enjoyable all around. I don't think queues would be bad at all, if I'm being honest. I think the longest queues might be like 5 minutes, but even then, for a DPS, a 5-minute queue is nothing. Like an LFR queue right now is like 20-something minutes.
Yeah.
If you're
And
queuing
as
as a
I said, that's
DPS.
my biggest point. If the solo queue system solves the waiting times, like, I'm all for it. You know, that's my biggest pain point this season specifically.
And also, it's just good for like people who like stream and stuff too, because like you have content you can do immediately.
Yeah, specifically for that, because otherwise it's not a good content if you stay in queue for 30 minutes, whatever the reason is. You know, you're just sitting
No, unless
there.
you're really good at talking and
Talking
risen
to
up
yourself,
your chat.
exactly.
Yeah, talking. Oh man, that's like the worst when you're just sitting in queue.
Yeah.
Just gotta play good music and vibe.
Well, Shah, if you have time I have one question for you if you have time for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so our community, I think we predominantly have healers. I mean, there's probably some tanks and just regular folks that do DPS or whatever that check us out, but we have a lot of healers, you know. And one of the questions I had for you is, from a tank's perspective, you know, you do a lot of PUGs. If you had one piece of advice for like a healer that's in between, let's say, level 5 keys and let's say level 10 keys, a consistent thing that you've noticed with some of the healers and problems in keys, what would your piece of advice to those players be?
Um, it's like weird because as a tank who's I'm pretty experienced. I normally don't have any issues with healers. Like I'm pretty self-reliant. So the things that I always notice is like healers won't like it generally won't prepare properly for the group damage. Or they might end up like because of group damage or instances like that, where they'll start kind of they shift their focus from like group healing, where that's like the most important thing, to trying to prioritize one person who got hit by a bolt, and then the whole group wipes because they weren't the right heal wasn't executed in that moment. I guess is like so my I guess my tip I guess my advice as an outside perspective from the tank role, watching like the group damage happen, that sometimes is inevitable, is like making sure you know what pulls are doing that type of like group damage versus single target damage, or even damage like pulls that you can do damage during as a healer. I know that's a controversial opinion. Some healers definitely don't like hitting their damage buttons because they're there to heal. But recognizing damage patterns from pull to pull is really important, and that's what you should probably focus on if you're looking to elevate your game from the 5s to the 10s and from the 10s to the 12s and the 12s and upwards, is understanding when those instances are happening, what kind of instances, and knowing how to counter it with your cooldowns.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great advice from a great content creator. So first, do we have any more questions for Sha? Because
That was my big burning question
I
for
mean,
sure.
I have a lot, but we can stand here talking for another hour. So maybe we can do that in another episode. So I'll throw it back to you, Sha. Any shout outs, anything that you want to say at the end?
Well, thanks for having me. This was fun. I don't do a lot of podcasts, so I can always talk for hours. So if you ever need another guest, feel free to invite me. But yeah, I have a YouTube channel and I do stream on Twitch. It's Shaw_IRL, I believe, on Twitch, and then I think no, it's both.
Check check the links below, guys. We're gonna have everything listed there if you want to find out more about him or find some great content about tanking. Everything's gonna be there. And one last question: do you do PTR testing and things like that?
Yeah, like religiously. As soon as that goes up, I will be living on PTR. You will not find me on live servers.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Well, maybe we can get you once the PTR is out and once we start testing a little bit. We're definitely going to do some episodes of what to expect with the new seasons, and maybe we can get you in so we have a different perspective, not just a healer one, for all the new dungeons and everything we get to test once it's out after the New Year's.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so it's been a great pleasure to have you. I would like to wish everybody happy holidays, happy New Year, and we'll see you guys on the other side in 2025. Again, check all the links below for more information specifically about chat and the podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Great holidays, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
See you.
And take care.
Cheers.